Well, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton. If you don't know me, I'm the Public Programming and Community Relations Librarian at Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. I say that because now that we're doing online events, we're seeing people from further afield, which is awesome. We love it. So I know there's at least one person not from the Seacoast area, and that is fabulous. Before we start, I would like to read our land acknowledgement, which we now make before each library event. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who called themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. So this event tonight is going to last until around 8 p.m. We plan to be respectful of your time. And this is the first week of a 2-week workshop. So let me say a quick note about format. Tonight will be much more of a presentation format. So everyone is muted and Terry will be sharing her screen and giving us a presentation. Next week will be much more of a discussion format where everyone will be able to share what they're working on, their ideas, and so on. And Terry will say more about that. But just in case tonight you think, oh, I wish I had more time to talk to people, it's coming next week. If you have questions about library services or upcoming programs, feel free to ask me at the end or send me an email. And as I mentioned, we will be recording the event tonight, so I will be putting this up on YouTube at some point in the next 2 weeks. I wanted to take a moment to give you a little preview of things happening in February, because I'm working this week on putting up all this publicity. So these things are not online yet, so you're getting like a first look. But by next week, they will all be online and you will be able to register for them. So I can share the links next week. We'll be hosting New Hampshire Winter Birds with the Audubon Society on February 1st. I'm personally very excited about that. We will be doing 2 author events next month, a fantasy romance author panel just in time for Valentine's Day on February 11th, and an author discussion of the European home front during World War II on February 18th. We'll also be hosting a new program that we hope to do every month called Drop-In Crafting, which will be geared toward adults, and that'll be on Saturday, February 20th. The idea is you don't have to register, you can just show up, chat with people, and work on whatever craft project you're into at the moment. That's just a very small subset of things that are coming up. And as I said, I will have the links to share next week. I will also share a link tonight to a page to sign up for our monthly email newsletter, which is the best way to find out about upcoming programs at the library if you're not already on it. Lastly, we love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library. And I'm going to share next week an online event feedback form. And I ask everyone to take just a few moments to fill that out after this 2-week workshop. It really helps us to find out what you'd like to see at the library. And also, if you are local, you can enter to win a library book bag, which we do a drawing for once a month. So we're really thrilled tonight to work with Terry Farish on this event. She's a pillar in our community and a very kind-hearted person and a fantastic author. I think you're going to learn a lot from her. She is the author of many picture books. Her first is The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup, illustrated by Barry Root. And her forthcoming picture book is A Feast for Joseph. Is it pronounced Odd Bonnie or O.D. Bonnie, Terry?
O.D. Bonnie.
O.D. Bonnie, with O.D. Bonnie, illustrated by Ken Daly. So I'll let Terry tell you a little bit more about herself. And Terry, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. With the situation we're in right now, can people say their name and where they're from, or should we save that for next week?
We could ask people to put it in the chat, and that way we don't have to worry about unmuting and then muting. Does that work for everyone?
Got it. Okay. All right. The chat, I want to invite you to use the chat quite a bit. I'm just going to see if I can pin. Okay. To use the chat, because I'm going to be doing most of the talking this time, but at the end of my presentation, Laura and I are going to do a Q&A responding to your questions in the chat. So don't feel that we're not talking, we're just talking Zoom-like. I wanted to start off by saying that writing a children's book is a powerful act. When you think about our audience, when you think about our audience is young children who are just beginning to make sense of the world, and everything that they look at or they touch, it becomes part of how they're making meaning. So when you write for young children, you are part of their experience of making meaning in the world, and it's a responsibility, it is power, and it's very, very exciting to think about a story that has value to you, that has authenticity to you. It could become a part of a child's first experiences of making meaning of the world. So I'm seeing all of your faces, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you in the chat. After you write your name, and I just want to know where you're from, where you live. And another thing I'd like you to write in the chat is a picture book that has been important to you in your life, either as a child or as a parent or a grandparent, a picture book that has meaning and something that might have been an inspiration for you to want to do this workshop. We are going to have two parts of this. One part is I'm going to show you in a very quick way a number of picture books and some of the ways that readers make meaning from what the writer has done. And we're going to focus on the writing of picture books in this workshop. Saying that, it's true that I'm going to show you a lot of images, and picture books would not work without images. But we're going to talk about what the writing can be done to tell the story, even while we totally honor how illustrations are the essential part, because the words are one way to tell the stories, and it's an amazing collaboration. If you're not both the illustrator and author, you could be just the writer, and then an illustrator joins you with the same text and tells the story in their own way through their visual art. So it's something much greater than what the writer does alone or the illustrator does alone comes together in a picture book. So we're going to talk tonight about what the writer does alone while we look at a lot of pictures. We're also going to focus on fiction. We're going to focus on stories. We're going to talk about some things that are fictionalized, but the focus will be on the traditional story picture book. Put questions in the chat as I talk so that when we come to the Q&A, I'll have your questions, and if we don't get to them, then if you choose to allow us to share emails, that's up to you. I can respond on email. I can do a group email with answers to questions that we might not have gotten to. If you have a notebook with you, that would be good. A notebook, a piece of paper, whatever you've got that's handy, so that as I present these techniques, these components, these devices to make meaning in a picture book, you can jot down something that could serve you when you're thinking about your own story. So I'm hoping that you will connect and draw from anything I talk about as a way that you could have a new tool, new paint for your own story. So you can jot down as I talk, and you can borrow these because all artists build on the work of artists before us. So if there's something in one of these books that excites you, then you can experiment with it and you can play with that and you could make it your own for your story. So I am going to start with this slideshow I have for you. And as I say, these are just a sampling, and this is a pretty quick workshop, an hour and a half to talk about all the things that a picture book writer does. So I may not touch everything, but I hope to give you a good sampling and some things that will inspire you. So now I'm going to go to screen share.
While you're doing that, Terry, let me say to everyone, generally when you sign up for a library program, librarians, if you didn't know, are very big on privacy. We don't share your email with anyone. So what I wanted to ask everybody was whether it would be okay with you for me to share your email address with Terry for the purposes of this workshop so that she can send us some things and perhaps answer a couple questions in the intervening week between this one and the next. So what you can do is you can write to me privately in the chat, or we can cover it again at the end, whether that would be okay with you.
So we are going to begin with a story called Wild Berries, and this is by Julie Flett, and she's a Cree Native American in Canada. And there's so many components to her picture book. She is also an author illustrator. This is a book that is a family memory. It's a very specific memory about picking berries. And it begins with a grandmother and a grandchild, but you will see in the next illustration that most of the story, the boy is older and he is with his grandmother picking berries. I'm going to take you, I have two illustrations for wild berries because there are things I wanted to show you. This is a book that is a story, but she's doing something interesting because she is the speaker of a language that is endangered. She is introducing some of the text in what's called Swampy Cree. And I know this because she has an author's note. And that's something, if you're doing something that could use some explanation, an author's note is something available to you. And she does something else, and I'm going to read you this passage. They pick the plumpest berries they can find and drop them into their buckets. Otis ki kawawa, tup tup. And throughout this story, she has the tiniest, most subtle sounds that go with the story. Just this idea of the sound of the blueberry hitting the bucket, tup tup. And children, of course, love to do sound effects. And so this might be something fun to do if your story is conducive to this delicate touch. Well, not all sounds are delicate, but this one is here. And the language, you might get some sense of the characterization. Maybe it's of the family that Julie Flett is describing, or maybe it's a Cree characterization. We need to know a little bit more, but there's something kind of elegant and spare in both image and the emotional tone that gives you a feel that you might know this grandmother. And take a moment to jot anything down if there's anything here that could serve you in your story. Now we're going to completely change pace. This is Bear Came Home, Bear Came Along. This is one of the cumulative tales that I wrote you about in that handout. Maybe you remember a book called The Napping House, The Napping Room, and that was an example of a cumulative tale where there's a grandmother that's taken a nap and then the grandchild is on top and the animals and all these animals and people are all gathering and then something explodes and they're no longer napping in the napping house. Well, this is a story called Bear Came Along. This is, oh, I'm covering up my authors, but you have this in your handout, and both in one list and also in the full list of books that you have, because I can't remember his name. This is a rambunctious tale. This is the tale about a bear, and once again, there's a raft, and all these creatures come onto the raft, and they're going down a river. And so this is a river tale. But there's something I wanted to tell you about this that I thought is so interesting about children's picture books, that we come to an illustration where the raft with the bear and all these animals are at the top of a falls, a very big fall like Niagara. And you know that if they're tipping over, something is about to happen. Now, this is a rambunctious tale. It's funny, but it could also be more serious, because what I found with kids, and it plays out in some picture books, is sometimes children like to be afraid. They like to see something that could go awry, and they want to know what's going to happen next. So sometimes being scary is very compelling to kids and could make for a very dynamite story. Now, this story is very fast-paced. There are cliffhangers, both literally and in terms of the text. And it's just the opposite of Wild Berries, because the Wild Berries is this structure of a day that's the story arc. And things happen to the boy. He sees animals that he loves, but the climax is that they have buckets of berries, and there's a recipe for blueberry jam. This story is much more of a story arc with, well, Wild Berries is a story arc too. It's just a different kind. But this one has a peak climax and a sense of something that the author wanted to do. He wanted to write about characters coming together, people coming to get together, and the impact of people on one another. So he's writing a little bit about interconnection. So that's the shape of his story. And of course, the fear of dying. Now, we're really getting into something that is funny and subversive, as I wrote to you about John Clayson's illustration. John Clayson is the illustrator of The Wolf, the Duck, and the Mouse, and Mac Barnett is the writer. John Clayson is known for his very, it could be called subversive, but he's very sly. And in his book, This Is Not My Hat, it's about a theft, it's about disloyalty, and then it's about murder. And it's very, very, very funny. And this book, The Wolf, the Duck, and the Mouse, is about, the first line of this is about the fact that a wolf and a mouse meet, and the wolf eats the mouse. So it's that same wry humor that kids could absolutely adore. And John Clayson's books are some of the most popular books in public libraries. Parents sometimes have trouble with them, but they're also books that philosophers have taken into classrooms. When people in classrooms they study philosophy with young children, and they look at some of the moral choices, like, was it okay in this case for the wolf to do what he did? And so there's some deep questions that are being posed. Some kids just think they're hysterical. So this is another kind of story that that's available for the different tastes of kids and the different tastes of people who buy picture books. I had to mention this one. I don't know if you remember Officer Buckle from way back. I used to be a children's librarian, and this was just the hit of story times. This is Officer Buckle and Gloria by Peggy Rathman. This is one of those laugh out loud children's books. It's a case where Officer Buckle is taking safety tips into classrooms, and the children are extremely bored. They fall asleep, they snore, they continue to have accidents because nobody pays attention, until one day Officer Buckle takes his dog Gloria. And Gloria, unbeknownst to Officer Buckle, is acting out what would happen if children didn't follow his safety tips. Well, kids love this because the kids know what the dog's doing, but Officer Buckle doesn't. And so I'll read you this one line. Safety tip number 2, said Officer Buckle, always wipe up spills before someone slips and falls. The children's eyes popped. And Officer Buckle thinks that suddenly he has become extraordinarily gifted in giving story tips. And so this is an interesting way that an author talks about a character, because she shows him as not effective. Then she shows him, how did I write this to myself? She shows him as someone when he finds out that people are laughing and responding because of the dog. So she shows him with hurt pride. She shows that he can have vanity. And then she shows him able to reflect on the situation with Gloria. And then she shows him gaining understanding, gaining wisdom. So her main character goes through a cycle of understandings about himself. And so that's how characterization is happening here. In the midst of all this chaos, there's so much noise here because there's so many accidents. And then Gloria is absolutely charming. My computer has never done this before. It's not moving forward.
You could stop sharing and restart, Terry, see if that does it.
Okay. Okay. There you all are. I get to see your faces for a little bit. Okay, I'm going to screen share again. We're going to change tone here because we're moving into a very different kind of book. We've been looking at some books that are entertaining, but also with depth. This is The Rope, is a story from the Great Migration. So this is a picture book that is telling history. And it's also based on the story of the author's grandmother. So we have got some memoir in here too. And what's interesting about this story that can teach us so much about writing a big story, how to contain it, what basket can possibly hold the story, is that she has got this idea of the rope. And the rope begins in, it's a rope, it's like right now she's jumping with it, but it's like a workman-like rope. And it is a part of the lives of this family from the time they live in South Carolina till later when they move to Brooklyn and to the next generation. I'll read you this passage. This is from Jacqueline Woodson is the author, James Ransom is the illustrator. This is the rope my grandmother found beneath an old tree a long time ago back home in South Carolina. This is the rope my grandmother skipped under the shade of a sweet smelling pine. So you can tell from the language that this is a prose poem, and that same rhythm moves through this story that is part memoir, part history, and also fiction, because she doesn't use her own family name. She's not trying to write autobiography. She's creating fiction from her family story. And this also, I think this is a good one to stop and talk about the heft of a story. When a child or a parent or a grandparent finish reading a story, ask yourself what you would like for your own story, what you would like them to take away. Maybe it's not something you would overtly say in the story, but it's between the lines. And there's something that is a truth that comes out of the story that the reader feels because the characterization is strong, because the illustration is strong. So sometimes when editors talk about a book that's too slim, they are talking about this need for another layer of depth or of heft to give this story resonance. You can think about what that could mean to your story. Oops. Okay, oh good, we moved forward. This is one of mine. It's a book that's coming out later this year. It's called A Feast for Joseph. And I wrote it with O.D. Boney. He is a refugee from South Sudan. And we did something interesting that I thought happened with this book, because the illustrator painted two periods of time. And sometimes they say you can't do a flashback in picture books. The children don't get flashbacks. And it's not so much a flashback as Joseph, the little boy, has a memory. He's in an American city, but he has a memory of what it was like when they cooked at home. And there was a whole lot more going on. And he's comparing the two, but the illustrator helped to make meaning with that memory by illustrating in two different time periods in one spread. You can't see it, but the text on the right-hand side also includes some words in Luo, which is the language of the Acholi people, O.D. Boney's people. And there's a word for a musical instrument they have called where they play the awal. There's a word for the basic food of the Acholi people called kwan. And these words are not italicized. And there's a movement in a whole lot of this country to look at English as one of many languages and to include other languages not italicized, just to bring them into the body of the ways that we speak, including English and many others. Now, this is a book. This is from a book called Love by Matt de la Pena. And I wanted to show you this illustration because Matt is writing about an emotion, and all literature turns on emotion, but he is addressing the word love. And he wrote this, he said, and he's talked about this in many ways, when he was talking to his own child who had fears. There were fears in the Hispanic community of deportation. And how do you talk to a child about separation? There are many things that children can be afraid of. In this case, there's discord between the mother and the father. And he wanted to write a book for his own child about the idea that no matter what happens, you are loved. And the book opens with this line. In the beginning, there is light and two wide-eyed figures standing near the foot of your bed, and the sound of their voices is love. And this has an authenticity in the way he is describing love. And I think that what's true for many children's book writers is that one way they're tapping into this authenticity is they're tapping into an emotion that they felt as a child. In fact, I think most picture book writers would say that. Yes, they think about kids today, but some of that deep emotion comes from a fear they had as a child, an absolute joy they had as a child, or some other emotion that is core to them. Now, this book is also a series of vignettes. So the story arc is not the traditional story arc of building tension, perhaps like Officer Buckle and Gloria, or like the bear who goes down the river. This is more like vignettes that build and build. And there's an image in here about children with their families gathered around a television. And I'm thinking that maybe children who with their parents after Wednesday, after the assault on the Capitol, there could have been many conversations or many ways to try to have conversations to talk to children about their emotions at that time. So this is the kind of picture book that tries to tackle that. Picture books can tackle fear and love in every possible way, but Matt decided to do it directly and to talk to a child about that they are loved. And so to call this about love, I would also call this about trauma, because love and trauma seem to be side by side, and to know that it's true that if a child has a consistency of people in their lives, trauma is much easier to handle. And so picture books sometimes address this role of how story supports people in their lives. This is the first book I wrote. This is The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup. And this book seems to there's so many ways to use language. I mean, that's our tool as writers. We only have language. And we can use levels of diction to capture a character, to show how a character is in the world. We can use the tempo of language. In the future book we're going to read, it's kind of like the rhythm of time moves through this. We could look at syntax. That's the way you can capture characters, how they use language. Like if you have a grandmother who uses language in a slightly different way, then that could capture her time period. It could capture that woman. This story seems to be known for its voice, and the voice is omniscient. No, it's somebody looking down on the old man and his cat in this story, but he's speaking in a colloquial way, the way a Texas guy could be talking. I'll give you an example, because there's also a refrain in this book. Many books have refrains, and children love refrains because there's predictability. They know what's going to happen next, and they start to speak the refrains. And they sometimes say them when they're not reading the book, because just refrains are like music. And probably picture books are very much like music. They often have repetitions. So here's part of the refrain for The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup. Fool cat, you ain't nobody's prize, never killed nothing, which was true. Not a mouse, nothing. But she was fond of the man's potato soup, which made him love her a breath more, but not so as you'd notice. So I stay pretty close to the old man's diction. And that's a way that I was trying to create this character. But you can see from the illustration that Barry Root, the illustrator, also does a lot of characterization in the illustration. And that will be true too for your book. And this is Hush Little Baby. And I'm showing you this version because this is a retelling of a folk song, Hush Little Baby. In this case, the retelling is done in pictures, but you could be thinking about doing a retelling in words. You can completely turn a story upside down in a retelling. And Marla Frazee does with this story, because this baby, you see, will not stop crying. And all the sweet lines of this folk song, if that mockingbird won't sing, I'm going to buy you a diamond ring. The words stay the same, but they're cause for this baby to keep on screaming. And so it's a very funny version of a tender tale. And that's another thing that you will be deciding for your story, is if you want the story to be very, very funny and you're going to go for the laughs, or if you want the story to be tender, or if you want the story to have a little bit of fear in it, if you want the story to be wry and play with that wry humor, and And if you were to do a retelling, you could choose that emotional tone that you would like your story to have. And I'm going to take you to Hello, Lighthouse. Now, this is the long view story. This is a story of a life. And it's when I say long view, I mean that in this book, there are key moments that are great leaps of time. There are key moments that are shown, and then great leaps of time that pass between these moments. Maybe you remember the book Miss Rumphius, about a woman who was looking for something to do to make the world more beautiful. And that's another example of this long view, where a lot of time passes between the key moments of the story. So we're going to stop here because I'm going to bring you into Hello, Lighthouse, and we're going to look really closely at one book. So I'm going to stop share here. And come back to you. Hi. It's wonderful to actually see you. Hello, Lighthouse. I'm gonna set this up a little book. So Hello, Lighthouse is written and illustrated by Sophie Blackall. I know that a lot of illustrators begin with a story. They begin with the story they want to write. It could be that some illustrators begin with an illustration. I know that publishers are interested in the text, they're interested in the story, and then they find the illustrator to illustrate that story. So even though she did these illustrations, we're gonna think of it as the text. And this was, I thought I would bring you this book because now we're getting really close to home with all of the lighthouses that we have around us right here on the seacoast. She's doing many things here. She is telling history, and you'll see the story arc. We'll talk about that as we go. She's also capturing emotion, but in a very different way. And I think I see the emotion here as like this steady movement of time that is happening in the sound of the language. Now, if you are interested in a structure, a pattern for your story, this could be an example of a pattern that a writer uses to create the story, because she has like a stanza or a piece of prose. Then she has a refrain, and the refrain is always the same until it's not. And then you know that this is the structure of her story. When she changes the refrain, something is about to change very much for the family that lives in this lighthouse. I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin with the end papers, because end papers are so interesting. Now, this is the artwork in the first part of a picture book, and these are selected because they're key to the story. They're somehow key to the theme, key to the emotion, or somehow central to the meaning that the author hopes that the reader takes away. In this case, these are tools of different times in the lighthouse keeper's life that are pictured here in these end papers. I'm going to begin this story. Now you can see this illustration is from way back. I mean, we've got this story is distant from its topic. It makes me think of John Steinbeck's story Chrysanthemums, which he starts way back, looking at this town from a great distance. And then the story gets closer and closer and closer and narrows in on the players in the story. So this story starts way back, and she's using that telescoping kind of method to bring us into the intimacy of the story. And I'm going to read you this first passage because it's also about a distance. I'm going to find ways to hold this. You won't be able to always see everything as I read. But I'm going to, do you have enough? Don't see if you have enough light. Yeah, we have more light on this. Yeah, that's better. Okay, here's a little bit of the language. On the highest rock of a tiny island at the edge of the world stands a lighthouse. It's built to last forever, sending its light out to sea, guiding the ships on their way. And then we have the refrain. And you can say this with me. You'll find out what it is. It's pretty simple. From dusk to dawn, the lighthouse beams. Hello, hello, hello. That's it. And there's a response to the lighthouse. Hello, lighthouse. And then you'll see that on this is the tender. And you'll see that whenever the tender comes to the lighthouse, something big is about to happen. And on this tender comes the lighthouse keeper, the new lighthouse keeper. In the next illustration, now the camera comes in close. And you can see that the lighthouse is round and round and round and round all the way to the top. And that's going to play into the story, the roundness of the lighthouse, kind of like the roundness of a life, the cycle of life. You'll see that in both illustration and text. So as you write, you could be thinking about perhaps shapes, about metaphors that you might not be writing about, but they could be part of how a young reader could find meaning when there are other ways than words that are telling the story, because they're in your mind, because many things that you come to understand about your story, you may not actually write in the story. And this is inside. This is the text from the other side, and I'm going to read this to you. I'm going to read you this one because this first one tells about really what a lighthouse keeper does. So she sets it up with this language. And again, 2, 4, 6, this is about a 10-line stanza before we get into the refrain again. The new keeper arrives to replace the old, to carry on tending the light. He polishes the lens and refills the oil and trims the burned end of the wick. Throughout the night, he rewinds the clockwork that keeps the lamp in motion. He writes in the logbook and threads his needle and listens to the gathering wind. So the writer is doing something interesting here, because not only does she have the stanza and then hello, 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 but this line he writes in the logbook is the last line of every stanza. And what he writes in the logbook is the pattern of what happens in this story. And so she's giving us lots of ways to find consistency in the telling of the story, which kids will love. They may pick up on this logbook. What's he going to do in the logbook next time? But in terms of the structure of a stanza, it's always consistently placed. The second to the last line tells you about the life happening. And then You can say this with me. We're going to do the refrain again. The wind takes a deep breath and blows and blows. Hello, hello, hello. And this is how she's doing characterization. Now you see, this is, it's certainly omniscient. We're not getting into his mind, but she's giving us some details about what he's doing to let you imagine his thoughts. And I'll read this to you. The keeper boils water and drinks his tea as he fishes for cod from the window. He sets the table and hums a tune and wishes for someone to talk to. Well, she does say he wishes. Every few days he writes her a letter and throws it into the waves. He tends the light and writes in the logbook and waits for her reply. She doesn't go into detail about any of that. You just some clues that he writes. And of course, we've got the refrain again. The sky grows dark, the waves rise and crash. Hello, hello, hello. The tender has come again, so you know something big has happened here. The keeper looks through his telescope. The tender arrives, bringing oil and flour and pork and beans and his wife. He shows her around the round rooms of their house. He tends the light and writes in the logbook and sets the table for two. The story continues. We have the refrain. There is a shipwreck, and the wife and the keeper save the men, bring them into the lighthouse and feed them. The sea turns into a carpet of ice, and you can say with me, hello, 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 and the light keeps beaming through. On. And then time passes, the wife becomes pregnant, and she is picturing this round room and a round belly and round breath. And I'm going to read this to you. I have to pull it away a little bit because the text is around the circle here. Inside the lighthouse, the woman walks round and round and around the room. Her husband boils water and helps her breathe in and out. He tends the light and writes in the logbook. And notes the birth of their child. You see how the logbook is the key moments. And a wonderful device because the logbook was essential to the work of the keeper. And the sky erupts in swirls of green, and the refrain, hello, hello, hello. Now, this spread I'm going to show you, I think, to me, it's almost the climax because you get a sense of what's going to happen next, although it doesn't happen. So no, it's building up to the climax, but you begin to know from this scene, a little bit reading between the lines, that this rhythm of language is taking us into a change in time here. So I'll show you this. You can also see from the expression on their faces. The tender arrives, telling, bringing oil and flour and pork and beans and the mail, along with fresh books and news from the land. There's an unexpected letter with the Coast Guard seal. The keeper winds the clock and polishes the lens just as he's always done. He tends the light and writes in the logbook, but knows that it's not for long. She doesn't say why, but we know. We know something. And you'll notice that the baby is growing up. Time is passing. The rhythm of time is continuing here. And together they watch the horizon. We don't have the refrain. She stops the refrain. That's the keeper. The Coast Guard arrives with a brand new light and installs the machine to run it. No lamp to fill, no wick to trim. The keeper's work is done. He climbs to the top of the spiral stairs and closes the logbook for good. They pack their belongings into the boat and wave farewell to the gulls. Now the refrain changes. There's a refrain. Beyond the breakers, they'll all look up. Goodbye, Lighthouse. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. And this on the, now we're coming back into that language. It's a little bit distanced. On the highest rock of a tiny island at the edge of the world stands a lighthouse. It is built to last forever, sending its light out to sea. The fog rolls in, the fog rolls out, the waves rise and crash. The wind blows and blows, and the refrain, hello, hello, hello. And this one opens out into an extra page. I'll read this one to you too. Over the waves, across the bay, a light on the land beams back. Hello, hello, hello. And they respond, hello, Lighthouse. And Sophie ends with the family in their new home, looking across the water to the lighthouse. She does something interesting that's available to you. She offers an author's note, and it's about her love of lighthouses and how she came to write this book. And do you know the scene where the wife is being carried and I don't know what to call that, that device that's carrying her. I thought that was a pretty ugly image to carry a woman that way. But she said that that's how they often carried people of all kinds, the doctor, other people, to come to the lighthouse. And so she gives a note for many of the illustrations that are background for children to understand this period of time when lighthouses needed to be run by a keeper. But I think what's most interesting is the structure of her language. And when you write your book, of course, you'll not be bound by any structure that you see, but you might find a structure that suits your story and can offer kind of a continuity for the reader and a predictability that is a way to build meaning as you move through your story. So we have looked at sound, patterns of sound in stories. We have looked at voice and how voice could be a way to characterize your main character in the story. We've looked at spareness of language as a way that could characterize the story. We've looked at emotional tone. Some of them were deeply emotional. Some of them were like, this is much more like a drumbeat of time, but it still had its own emotion. It's not hitting on any of the, not like Matt de la Pena, but it's a way that shows that things change. Things are always changing and evermore. She was able to capture with this staccato beat. We've talked about how in many of the books, there is one central thread to hold the story. For instance, with Wild Berries, it was simply an act of berry picking, which she used as a thread to, to show one family, to show something of the Cree culture and animals that are a part of the Cree community. With the rope, that central, not even a metaphor, it's a concrete object. And sometimes a concrete object is the best thread for the writer to use to guide the reader through something that's very large, like the Great Migration. How can you take the Great Migration and tell a child about it? Let's do it with a rope, and how a rope came every step of the way. Would you take just a minute with your journal or whatever paper you have with you to write down an idea that's come to you in looking at these stories that you don't want to lose? One of these things that you think you might use, and maybe a little bit of a way that you think you might use it. So just do a free write using one of these devices, one of these techniques, and just play with how it might work for you. We'll just take just 2 minutes. Okay, we'll pause there. I hope you jotted things down along the way. We'll talk more about the writing in a little while. I see we've got lots of questions in the chat. That's wonderful. But before we go to the chat, I want to talk about your writing. And I'm hoping that some of these, even reading for me, some of these things gave me ideas, and I've read these books before. I think I'm first a reader. I just love the reading, and it's from reading that I get ideas. Sometimes I read for a while and then I have to put a book down because I have to write. So reading itself is a muse. Yes, be sure while I talk, if you would put some questions in the chat so that I can understand where you are, because we're not talking. And so I'd really love to hear a comment you have about any of the books that I showed you, a question you have about something I said, or a question you have about any of the devices or components that we've talked about. Just jot them in the chat and don't worry if there's misspelling. Just give us some of your thoughts to work with. But I want to talk about writing. I want to bring some mindfulness practices into your writing, partly because mindfulness has been really important to me as a writer, and it's hard work, and there's some things that mindfulness has taught me to be kind to myself as a writer, and I'm hoping that this will be meaningful to you. That's why I quoted from Everyday Sacred in the handout. She says that stories move in circles, and part of the finding is the getting lost. So in this next week, when you are drafting a story, just know that if you're lost, you're doing it right. Getting lost is definitely part of the journey. And it's okay if you don't know what you're doing. Yep, that's okay too. And part of mindfulness also to me has been about not judging. Whatever stage you're in with this, if you're working on something that you've been working with for a while, if you're just coming up with an idea of something you'd like to write, just allow yourself this excitement of exploring and discovery. And not that it's good or bad, we're going to forget that. We're going to forget that completely. And then there's this quote from John Kabat-Zinn that I love. He says that patience is a kind of wisdom. And by that, with a story, just know that things unfold in their own time. But the reason I said this is intense is that I'm giving you a week between now and next Thursday to think about a story that you would like to work on. And it could be that, we'll all be in different places. It could be that you have a framework for a story, you have an idea for a story, and that's where you are with this, and you can bring that back to us. It could be that you have a draft of a story and you have a full story that you can bring to us. It could be that you have questions, that you are full of questions, and you bring your questions back to us. So wherever you are in this stage with your picture book, it's the right stage, because this will unfold. And they do take a long time. I think I wrote The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup over 10 years at least, because it came back to me in many different ways. I moved it from England to Texas, and then after I wrote it, it didn't work for many reasons. So things unfold. And just finding the authenticity of a story takes time. I think the authenticity, like I talked about, like the way that Matt de la Pena tapped into his boyhood to find that emotion that was so visceral in his book, Love, that doesn't come automatically. That comes when you've written something and it's pretty good. But there's another layer yet to peel down to. So it could be that each draft is another layer to go a little bit deeper. Sometimes I always think whenever I write something, I've got it. But then you go back to it the next day and you can do more. You can dig a little bit deeper. I've only given you a week, and that's not fair. No, so whatever process you're in by next Thursday, then just honor that and know that it's a process. And this is the beginning. What else do I want to say about mindfulness? That's good. So in the handouts I gave you, I gave you a list of picture books and mentioned that they're at the Portsmouth Public Library, and all of my books that are around me, I'm taking them back tomorrow, Laura, so people can check out these books. And if you can't get your hands on a book, as I wrote to you, so many authors and teachers have read these stories on YouTube, so you can listen to almost, I think, all of these books on YouTube with your child, if your child is with you, and or your grandchild, and so you can get a sense of these stories. I'm going to stop talking because of the time. Okay, Laura, let's talk, you and me, and you can ask me questions.
Okay, great. I wanted to share some thoughts that people had before we get into the questions. Bob says he likes the idea of a refrain in the story, and Kathy made a good comment. I feel like a lot of what makes a children's story great is the universal emotion or theme that translates to adults too, which sort of goes back to what you were talking about with channeling the emotions that you felt strongly as a child, and not necessarily needing another person who's currently a child to give you that inspiration, which I liked. So going back, but there are tons of questions now, which is great. Joyce asks, would you classify Love, the book that you showed us, as a fiction or a concept book?
Oh, Joyce. They're vignettes, they're fictional vignettes. So I would classify it as fiction. There's somewhat of an arc because of the progress of the vignettes. So yes, but they're also prose poems. They're individual prose poems that build one on the other. So it's a story.
Great, thank you. There are a lot of good questions about maybe your personal process or experience. Mimi says, I find it hard to start with a character. Starting with a memory is easier for me. So her question is, can you start with anything?
I think every writer has their own way of entering a story, and they definitely can start with anything. But a memory is a big thing. A memory could be with a free write kind of winnowed down to a bird or a color or a rope or a blueberry. So yes, memory is often a way into the story, and then you find this central object that you can work with to carry this story.
So would you say that asking yourself that question that you talked about, what would you like your readers to take away with them, that might help to sort of narrow it down if you're starting with a memory?
I think I would have to know more about the story to take it that far. A memory is probably key to all of us and everything we write. So we would have to know more about what in the story is important to the writer, that they need to tell it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think probably any of us who've had previous writing experience know that sometimes you'll start writing and something you didn't expect comes out, or something unfolds that you didn't know was going to. So.
Always, because writing is a discovery. Writing is not writing down a memory or writing down something that you heard and you know. Every sentence you write is a discovery of what you come to know by the process of writing. Writing itself is a process of discovery.
That's great. I just wrote that down.
Can I just say that 3 times? I think so.
Yeah, good though. Pat asks, do you think for the purposes of this class it might be best to start with something totally new, or is it just up to everybody who's here to choose either new or previously unfinished ideas to work with?
I love generative workshops where, with which this was the idea of this, is to kind of help you tap into your imagination and to do something brand new that might be fun. But it could also affect these techniques we've looked at could be a part of something that's a work in progress. I think it'd be fun if we tried some. I'm going to do it too. Let's all try something brand new, and then maybe you'll learn for your book that you're currently working on. But
Yeah,
that's not you can do something you're working on if you need to. But
okay.
I'm going to do a new book.
That's good. Thank you. Chance asks, do you personally write by pouring words onto the page and then cleaning up and editing afterward? Or are you painstaking with every word from the start?
In a free write, I'm very good. In a free write, I'll just pour words on the page and I'll go a lot of different directions that aren't working for me. I'll just go there. And so the free writes, I get more, I generate more. When I'm actually composing a picture book or a novel, I'm a little bit more painstaking with my sentences because I discover a lot when I find the right words. So I'm a slow writer. Yes.
And I think everybody's different. Yeah, I mean, that might not necessarily be everybody's process.
No, in fact, a lot of people recommend just writing and not editing. Don't even look back. Just write it all down and then look at the whole of what you've got and edit then. So there are many ways.
Someone else asked another question about process. When you write, Jale asked, are you visualizing the pictures as well? The visual dimension seems so integral to the story. And so she's wondering, how do you do it if you're not also illustrating?
No, that's interesting because we are looking at finished products. We are looking at things that didn't work for years, maybe. And now they work and they have illustrations beside them. And so it's not really fair. I should have shown you some of my drafts. No, when as a writer, not the illustrator, I don't have pictures in my mind. I have emotion. I have some sense of what in my mind what the characters look like, but I don't have like a spread. I don't know where the illustrator will make a big color spread. I don't have it laid out as a dummy, as a picture book dummy. I'm writing a story. And I'm writing a story that I know will be illustrated. I'm still going to put details in there that help me find the truth that I want to tell in the story. Like in The Cat Who Liked Potato Soup, I said that the guy was always wore a Dallas Cowboys cap, except when he was in the shower. And the illustrator put the Dallas Cowboys cap on his head, but saying that helped me meet my character. So go ahead and I would say write generously, even though when you begin to work with an illustrator, some of those details in the language can be pared away because they're in the illustration. But as I write, no, I don't think of illustration. I'm just telling the story in the language that I think best captures the story.
That's great. Thank you. A couple of comments here. Arna loves the concrete examples that you gave, especially as they apply to the art of writing children's book. I think that means less the visual art and more just that it is an art to write children's books specifically. But she also says she's grateful that you described John Klassen's books as stories with deep philosophical meanings and thoughts because he's so extraordinarily creative. And she always wondered how to write stories like his. Thinking of it that way helps her to frame a story of subversion. So thank you.
Okay, good. Subversion.
And a follow up on Jolly's question about illustration. It's interesting, she says, because as you presented this evening, all of her ideas came as images, which I think is probably the case for other folks as well.
What came as images?
the ideas that she was having.
Oh, came as image. So in your notebook, you were doing sketches. Okay, cool.
Maybe just seeing it in her head. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just visualized it, which is interesting. I didn't think that would happen. But instead of thinking about story, I just had floods of images in my, so that's what I was asking you about, whether you're thinking of not necessarily the illustrations, but how much of it is, because to me a picture book is so visual, even with a story that's written.
Okay.
I just found myself seeing it all, seeing all these ideas instead of thinking about the words, which is different for me. So I just wondered if that's typical or.
Well, yes, I can address that question differently, because I was thinking about the illustrations that actually appear with text in the book. No, when I write, I do see. And it seems like when I write, and the characters can change the deeper I see them. I see their mannerisms more distinctly the closer I see how their faces would show disappointment, you know. So it is very visual in my mind, but just not the way it would be in a picture book.
Well, that's interesting. Let's see. I was curious because we were talking about John Clayson. His books tend to be very funny as well. And for some reason, the element of a book that kept coming up for me while you were presenting was, I don't know if everybody remembers Go Dog Go. I mean, from the 60s, but my nephew, who's 4, still has that book. So it's still, you know, really popular. That those two dogs who keep meeting, and one says, "Do you like my hat?" and the other one says, "No," over and over. And then in the end, finally does like her hat. I think she is, you know, seems to be female. I have always loved that moment because it's so funny. It doesn't really relate to the rest of the book. And I'm just wondering if you can say any more about sort of humor in books and where that comes from in your experience.
Yeah. Humor is absolutely gold, and it so delights, and it's so individual. Sometimes humor is so understated, and sometimes it's this kind of silly goofiness, but it tickles the funny bone so much. I find, let's see. Okay, I think this is hysterical. I'm going to read. The Wolf, the Duck, and the Mouse. I kind of like understated humor where they're playing a little bit. Now here's The Wolf, the Duck, and the Mouse. It begins: early one morning, a mouse met a wolf, and he was quickly gobbled up. And that's the first line of the story. I like that wry humor. I think, you know, it startles kids. They're not. It's startling, and oh, well, what's going to happen next? Oh, well, they have this nice living experience inside the wolf's belly. Oh, I didn't know that could happen. So that's one kind of humor. But Officer Buckle is just laugh out loud funny, and kids love. I think they love that when adults don't know as much as animals or kids do, when they're playing a trick on adults. That's hysterically funny if you can pull that off, where the kid is the one that understands the situation and the parents don't. Sometimes it's because the parents are absent-minded. There's a wonderful book, and I cannot remember who the author is, but the illustrations show a boy who's going to go into the ocean. They're at the ocean, and he's telling his father all these things he's going to do. But the father says, and he's reading a newspaper. He doesn't know anything that's going on. And the child is having this whole other fantasy happening while the parent is reading the newspaper and totally oblivious to this child. And so the humor is about the lack of awareness. And of course, the child now has the power in this story, and the child is having a high time that the parent doesn't even know that they're getting away with. So, yeah. maybe some of you will do funny stories.
Well, I had a question that's sort of related. It's just like, well, I think this is funny. How do I know kids are going to think this is funny? You never really know. But I'm curious for you, Terry, if you test your story out, if you have readers who are kids ever, to say, what do you think about this? Do you like it? You know, that kind of thing.
I don't think I've ever done that. I know that many, well, of course, my poor daughter has to read everything. Oh no, you're not another book, Mom. But I think that I don't so much read works in progress to kids. I tend, because kids just love you. Kids want to sit on your lap and read the story with you, and you could read them almost anything. But if they have your attention and you can giggle with them, they probably would love the book. So it could be that someone that you love might not be the best critic for how great the book is, but you would have so much fun reading with them. But you might have a critique group that would be give you better feedback.
That makes a lot of sense.
I've said that, but I know that there are a lot of people that probably get good ideas from kids too. And like, if you go into a classroom, they can help you name a character and do lots of fun things for a work in progress.
That's great. Thank you.
But I think there's something so extraordinary about reading a picture book to a child, because it's about the picture book and it's about the child, but it's very much about being together with two people who love each other and are bonding over the book.
Yeah. Okay, so Bob has a question, and this relates to reading out loud to a classroom. He says a book that he's read many times is Dory's Story by Jerry Pallotta. And he's saying, when trying to write about adventure, how do you narrow the adventure and not go off on a tangent?
Oh, I remember a story. That's an African tale, isn't it? I think that adventure would also have to have a thread through it that you as a storyteller can hold on to help you tell the story, that's got a beginning and a middle and an end to satisfy the reader. So an adventure is a great big concept, like a memory is a great big concept. What are we holding on to? What can you hold on to as the writer? Otherwise, you are, and you could be writing many things that aren't connected. How do you see, and I often think of with a story, with fiction, that you've got a character who wants something, and they are trying to get this thing, but there are obstacles in their way. And that's why people like to read fiction is, how does someone get what they want? And how can they achieve this when parents or some other force is preventing them from getting what they want? So maybe in this adventure, I guess I need to know more. It's a very broad concept, but you're looking for something central. You're looking for the blueberry or the rope within the adventure to let the story travel on, to have continuity. And what do you want the reader to take away with when they finish? You probably want to give them, something that's got a truth to it. What kind of truth are you building to? What kind of universal theme could you be addressing? You might not talk about that universal theme, but it could be there between the lines. What would you put on the end papers? What's key to the story that you could use as your key concrete objects to build the story on?
That's great. What kind of truth are you building toward? I think is probably a good way to wrap up. Mary has something. Oh, sorry, Mary Lou has something she just wants everybody to go look at. A video of a Scottish grandmother reading to a baby, and she gets to laughing, and it's a delight to watch. You can look it up on YouTube. The first line is, "I was walking down the road and I saw a donkey." That may give some inspiration in the coming week.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Terry, do you have final words before I stop the recording?
Yes, I do have a final word, and it's from a book. I just wanted to tell you about one book. It's a lullaby, and I wanted to end with just a few lines from a lullaby, if you will allow me, because it's nighttime and it's time for a lullaby. But this is called Nama and the Ark at Night, and I love this because it's about Noah's wife. I love these books where the wife gets to be the protagonist in this. But this is a book that is in a very specific form of poetry called a ghazal. And it's an Arabic form of poetry in couplets. But another layer of this is that the, the line just before the last line rhymes. So I'm just going to give you an example so you can have a ghazal for your lullaby tonight. Nama and the Ark at Night. You won't see the pictures, I'll just read to you. As the rain falls over the ark at night, as water swirls in the dark at night, as thunder crashes the seams of night, as Noah tosses in dreams of night, as restless animals prowl at night, as they pace and roar and growl at night. And it continues like that with that very distinct rhyme scheme that could be fun to play with.